For 3 decades, Johnny Carson was more than just a late-night host. He was America's trusted gatekeeper to the stars. Every night, millions tuned in to watch Hollywood's biggest names laugh, joke, and share stories on his couch. On screen, Carson made it all look effortless, flashing that warm smile and quick wit that made audiences feel like they were right there in the room. But what viewers didn't know was that Carson had a very different side once the cameras stopped rolling. Off-screen, he kept a private mental list, a secret blacklist of celebrities he thought were cruel, manipulative, or just plain rotten behind their glamorous facades. To the public, these icons were untouchable. To Carson, they were monsters hiding in plain sight. Crew members often said Johnny had one simple test. How did a star treat the assistants, the cameramen, the people who couldn't advance their career? If they were kind, he respected them even if they were difficult guests, but if they were cruel to the powerless, Carson never forgot. Over the years, he quietly shared shocking stories with close friends, tales of legendary actors and actresses who audiences worshipped, but who left him disgusted when the lights went off. And while Carson rarely spoke publicly about his disdain, those who worked with him knew exactly which names he would never forgive. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on that secret list. These are the 5 Golden Age stars who Johnny Carson reportedly despised the most, the guests who turned his smile into a mask and who he believed revealed the darkest side of Hollywood fame. And we'll start with the one who shocked him more than anyone else.
Jerry Lewis has been entertaining audiences all over the world since he was a little teeny boy. And he's still a little teeny boy.
Jerry Lewis was one of the most recognizable entertainers in America. A comedian, actor, director, and even humanitarian, his name carried a kind of legendary weight in Hollywood. Millions loved his slapstick humor, his manic energy, and of course his famous annual telethons raising money for children's health. To the outside world, but Johnny Carson saw something very different when Lewis came onto The Tonight Show. Behind the scenes, the man who claimed to care so deeply about children and charity could be shockingly cruel to the very people who worked to make him look good. According to multiple staff accounts, Lewis treated production crews with open contempt, barking orders, refusing to learn anyone's name, and reducing people to "hey you" or "camera guy." Even worse, Lewis didn't just save his disdain for underlings, he went after Carson himself. In one infamous appearance, Lewis repeatedly interrupted Johnny, hijacking questions meant for other guests. At one point, he even reached over and adjusted Carson's tie without permission, a move that visibly irritated the normally unflappable host. And here's the thing, everyone on staff knew one rule. You did not touch Johnny Carson unless he initiated it. Lewis knew that too. Some insiders believed he did it deliberately just to establish dominance. But what really disgusted Carson was the hypocrisy. He would watch Lewis cry on national television during his charity telethons, presenting himself as a saint for children, and then see the exact opposite behavior when the cameras weren't on. Staffers described him as demeaning, dismissive, and downright hostile to people who couldn't help his career. Carson reportedly told a colleague after one appearance, "He's what happens when ego outruns talent." Eventually, Carson had enough. After one particularly tense encounter in the early 1980s, he made the rare decision to blacklist Lewis from The Tonight Show entirely. That was almost unheard of. Carson tolerated a lot of difficult guests for the sake of ratings. But Lewis crossed a line. Years later, in private conversations, Carson didn't hold back. In a town filled with egos and phonies, he said, Jerry Lewis stood out as truly hateful. And if that was Carson's opinion of a beloved philanthropist, imagine how he felt about the next guest, a former child star whose behavior backstage made everyone on set uncomfortable.
My first guest, you all know, I have known Mickey Rooney for 20 minutes.
Mickey Rooney was once Hollywood's golden boy. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, he was the #1 box office draw in America. The cheerful, energetic kid audiences adored in classics like the Andy Hardy films. He was a living link to the golden age, and by the time he came on The Tonight Show in the 1970s, his name still carried the glow of Hollywood royalty. But behind the nostalgia, Rooney had developed a reputation that made producers and staff nervous the moment they saw his name on the schedule. To put it bluntly, Carson thought Rooney had never really grown up. He might have been in his 50s and 60s during his Tonight Show visits, but his behavior was closer to that of a reckless teenager. For one thing, Rooney was unpredictable with alcohol. Staff members claimed he showed up intoxicated more than once, slurring words, stumbling through stories, and losing his train of thought mid-sentence. In one infamous appearance, he launched into an anecdote about Judy Garland that veered into territory so inappropriate that Carson had to abruptly cut him off and change the subject on live television. Afterward, Carson was overheard asking his producer, "Is he drunk, or is this just who he is now?" Even more troubling was Rooney's behavior toward women on set. Several production assistants dreaded being assigned to him because he developed a reputation for crossing boundaries. Former staffers recalled how he would grab a woman's hand a little too long when she brought him water, pull her closer under the guise of conversation, or make comments that left them visibly uncomfortable. By the 1970s, that kind of behavior was already unacceptable, and Carson, who wasn't exactly known as a moral crusader, was still embarrassed enough to apologize directly to women who had to deal with it. One director later said, "I've never seen Johnny so personally embarrassed by a guest's behavior." Carson eventually made adjustments. Rooney's appearances became less frequent, and when he was booked, tapings were sometimes shifted to earlier in the day to reduce the risk of late-night drinking. It was Johnny's way of minimizing the chaos while still respecting Rooney's star power. But even with those precautions, Rooney remained a liability. He represented something Carson despised, a star who thought his fame excused behavior that would never be tolerated in a normal workplace. And if Rooney left Carson embarrassed, the next guest left him outright infuriated. Because when it came to Bette Davis, her tongue was sharper than a knife.
Sensational monologue
Thank you.
tonight. Nobody ever mentioned your monologues.
Bette Davis was Hollywood royalty. With her unmistakable voice, razor-sharp wit, and 2 Academy Awards, she was one of the greatest actresses of her generation. By the time she appeared on The Tonight Show, Davis was already a legend, and audiences tuned in to hear her tell old Hollywood stories in that fiery, unforgettable style. On camera, she could be funny, charming, and captivating. But off camera, Carson found her absolutely exhausting. Crew members described her as confrontational, sharp-tongued, and impossible to please. She didn't just trade witty barbs, she cut people down. When booked alongside other guests, especially younger performers or other women, Davis would interrupt, dominate the conversation, and even physically turn her back on them as if they didn't exist. One talent coordinator remembered, if someone else was getting laughs, you could see her seething. She was already plotting how to take the spotlight back. Worse, Davis sometimes went after the staff. She reportedly demanded whiskey in her dressing room before tapings, and when she had been drinking, her remarks became even more brutal. Makeup artists and cue card holders remembered her using sexist or racist insults without hesitation. One makeup artist recalled Davis refusing to let her work, sneering, "Find me someone whose hands don't shake like a drunk." For Johnny, who usually avoided confrontation at all costs, Bette Davis pushed him past his limit. During one rehearsal, she berated a cue card holder for being too slow. Carson stepped in quietly but firmly, telling her, "Miss Davis, on this show we speak to everyone with respect or we don't speak at all." She was reportedly stunned, not used to being challenged, and actually backed down. But the damage was done. Carson admired Davis's immense talent, but he also believed talent didn't give anyone the right to humiliate others. After her final appearance in the early 1980s, Carson told his producer, "That's the last time." Life's too short to be verbally flogged by Bette Davis, no matter how many Oscars she has. If Davis represented the razor-sharp cruelty of Hollywood's golden age, the next name on Carson's blacklist represented something even darker, raw intimidation, because when Frank Sinatra walked into a room, even Carson felt the tension.
Whose records do you put on?
Frank Sinatra was one of the most powerful entertainers of the 20th century. To the public, he was the smooth crooner with the velvet voice. Old blue eyes, the ultimate symbol of class, charm, and cool. On The Tonight Show, he could crack jokes, tell stories, and leave the audience hanging on every word. But Carson saw something far more menacing beneath the charm. Behind the scenes, Sinatra brought an atmosphere of fear. He rarely arrived alone. Instead, he rolled into the studio with an entourage of up to 8 men, not fellow entertainers, but what staff quietly described as guys you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. They spread through the building, watching the crew, creating a sense that the entire studio was under surveillance. One cameraman later said, "It was like being on set with the mob." You felt like if you looked at him the wrong way, something might happen. And then there were Sinatra's outbursts. During one taping in the early 70s, a floor manager gave Sinatra the standard 3 minutes cue before his segment, routine procedure for every guest. Sinatra didn't take it well. According to multiple witnesses, he grabbed the man by his tie, pulled him close, and hissed, "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes. I'll go on when I'm ready." The manager, a Korean War veteran, was left shaken. Watching from his office monitor, Carson nearly pulled the plug on the segment. The only reason he didn't was because his producer reminded him of the ratings Sinatra would bring in, but Carson never forgot. He hated bullies, especially when they, picked on people who couldn't fight back. His patience grew thinner when Sinatra began canceling appearances at the last minute, sometimes after already arriving at the building, deciding simply that he wasn't in the mood. The final straw came during a commercial break when Sinatra made a cruel comment about a female staff member's appearance, loud enough for others to hear. For once, Carson broke his usual detached professionalism and snapped back, "We don't talk about my staff that way here." Those nearby said the tension in the room was electric. Sinatra wasn't used to being challenged after that. Carson limited Sinatra's appearances to once a year at most. For a host who rarely interfered with bookings, it was a strong statement. Behind the smile, Johnny couldn't stand the way Sinatra used his power, charm for the cameras, intimidation for everyone else. And yet, even Sinatra wasn't the one who disturbed Carson the most. That spot was reserved for a Hollywood legend whose icy charm melted the moment the cameras turned off. For Johnny, Joan Crawford was the true queen of cruelty.
It wasn't an aloof-like goddess like a Garbo.
Joan Crawford was the definition of old Hollywood glamour. Immaculate hair, flawless posture, and that commanding presence. When she sat on Johnny Carson's couch in 1970, audiences saw nothing but grace. She embodied what people thought a movie star should be. But Carson quickly learned that beneath the polished exterior, Crawford was a nightmare. Even before she arrived at the studio, her demands set the tone. She sent over a 4-page memo detailing everything from the exact angle of her chair to the studio temperature, which had to be exactly 67 degrees, not 66, not 68. She even brought her own makeup team, dismissing The Tonight Show's award-winning artists as if they weren't good enough for her. And once she was inside the building, the facade of elegance cracked. Staffers recalled how Crawford treated people based entirely on status. To Carson, she curtsied with sweetness and charm. But when a 20-year-old production assistant accidentally entered her dressing room with a tray of water, Crawford unleashed hell. Witnesses said she launched into a tirade so vicious that people in the hallway froze. She called the young woman names, sneered that she was brainless, and even suggested she find work in a brothel where incompetence might be an asset. The girl fled in tears. Crawford demanded she be fired. Carson's producer refused, but the tension poisoned the entire taping. And what unsettled Carson most wasn't just the cruelty, it was the performance. Crawford could flip the switch instantly. During commercial breaks, she sat stone-faced in silence, cold as marble. But the second the red light blinked on, she transformed into America's sweetheart, laughing, glowing, pretending every moment was spontaneous. Carson tried to connect with her, but he later told Ed McMahon, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." Years later, when Joan's daughter Christina published Mommy Dearest, exposing her alleged abuse at home, Carson wasn't surprised. According to friends, he just nodded and said, "I saw who she really was in those few hours." I believe every word for Johnny Carson. Joan Crawford was the perfect example of Hollywood's darkest truth. That the people America worshipped as icons could be ice-cold tyrants once the cameras were gone. Johnny Carson spent 30 years smiling alongside Hollywood's biggest names, but he also saw what the rest of America never did. Behind the gowns, tuxedos, and polished charm were people who could be cruel, arrogant, and sometimes downright dangerous. For Carson, it didn't matter how many Oscars you had or how many records you sold. His test was simple. How did you treat the people who couldn't give you anything in return? The makeup artists, the assistants, the camera crew. If you were kind, Johnny respected you, but if you showed your darkest side to those without power, you earned a spot on his silent blacklist. That's why he could call Jerry Lewis truly hateful. That's why he felt embarrassed by Mickey Rooney, exhausted by Bette Davis, disgusted by Frank Sinatra's intimidation, and utterly chilled by Joan Crawford's cruelty. These weren't just difficult guests. They were the faces of Hollywood's hidden rot. And maybe that's the real lesson here. The golden age of Hollywood looked glamorous on screen, but Carson's stories remind us that fame can hide just as much darkness as it reveals. The camera adds more than 10 pounds. It adds a layer of fiction. So the next time you see old footage of Hollywood's brightest stars, ask yourself, who were they really when the lights went off? Because if these 5 legends could hide their cruelty behind fame, imagine how many others slipped through unseen. And if you thought this list was disturbing, wait until you hear what was happening behind the scenes of a beloved sitcom from the 1980s, where the cute child star reportedly left the crew so terrified that producers installed panic buttons on set. That story is coming soon, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. If you enjoyed uncovering the darker side of Hollywood's golden age, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I'd love to hear what you think. Which of these stars shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's talk about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.